Hey Cheyenne East. We're back for another part of our topic analysis. This line of videos, if you've watched our overall topic analysis, will begin diving into the specific areas of criminal justice reform involved in this topic. And we're going to start with policing. So let's talk about policing at the federal level, because if you remember from the topic analysis video, the distinction between the federal and state criminal justice systems is very important for the affirmative and negative teams on this topic. So let's start with understanding federal law enforcement. There's a lot of them, and there's a lot of acronyms on the screen, and I will go through each of those, but chances are you're somewhat familiar with the federal agencies listed. We have the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, which doubles not only as a law enforcement branch, but it is also where the vast majority of the forensic science work done at the federal level occurs. You have the U.S. Marshals. You have ICE, which stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so they are essentially border law enforcement. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which, as its name suggests, deals with drug-related crimes, and mainly their focus is international, but they also have some role in domestic drug issues. There's the National Park Police. That's the group of law enforcement officials who polices places like Yellowstone National Park. And then there's the Department of Homeland Security, which in and of itself is not a law enforcement agency, but has law enforcement branches and ties with other law enforcement officials. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There's certainly more, but these are the key players in federal law enforcement. So as you think about what policing under this topic really means, you need to be thinking about these agencies and what they do. So if you want to go learn more about them, that's highly recommended. Jurisdiction. If you remember from our topic analysis video, jurisdiction is an important word for the court system. Jurisdiction is also an important word when it comes to understanding federal law enforcement or policing done at the federal level. Those agencies we just looked at have some pretty specific jurisdictional requirements, things they can enforce and police and things that they can't. So an obvious one is they can enforce federal laws, and that typically falls on FBI, U.S. Marshals, and some of the more direct and generalized law enforcement agencies. They deal with international issues and terrorism issues. The Department of Homeland Security, the Drug Enforcement Administration would be perfect examples of that. National parks, that's the Park Police, and then immigration would fall to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement branch of the departments that deal with immigration issues. So the reason that jurisdiction is ultimately important in understanding policing is related to potential arguments that people may make. For example, if someone tries to make the argument that ICE has too much authority because we're worried about them interacting with forensic science, well, that isn't how the federal system works. Their jurisdiction is limited to border enforcement and immigration-related issues. Likewise, they wouldn't be dealing with drug enforcement. That would fall to the DEA and vice versa. So again, as you think about law enforcement and policing at the federal level under this topic, you got to keep in mind the specific role and jurisdiction of each of those agencies. So let's talk about the duties of policing at the federal level. They have really two roles. There's an investigative role, and then there's an enforcement role. Investigation seems pretty straightforward, right? We view police as going out and investigating potential crimes, identifying suspects, but there's a little bit more to it at the federal level. For example, the FBI has a number of its components tasked with investigating terrorism-related activity and stopping that terrorist-related activity. That is not a traditional investigative role. We think sort of that's more of an intelligence gathering role, but they serve that purpose here in the United States. There is also investigation in the sense of forensic science. I mentioned this a moment ago. The FBI has an extensive crime lab, a number of crime labs actually, that do a lot of work. The FBI is home to the largest DNA database in the country, and in fact that database is used by state law enforcement officials to investigate for example, DNA that they might acquire in the course of a crime committed under their jurisdiction. Then we have the enforcement angle. That's what we probably see most on TV shows, where these law enforcement agencies are going out into the world to enforce laws by arresting people, running down suspects, in the case of ICE, deporting people, the Drug Enforcement Administration interdicting drugs, and a whole host of other things specific to the jurisdiction of those respective law enforcement agencies. But these two roles are important, again, to keep in mind for our arguments. The arguments related to whether policing at the federal level is good or bad really should be confined to whether police are doing the investigation right or they're doing the actual enforcement mechanisms of their jobs correctly. These, however, shouldn't be confused with, for example, sentencing, because they don't actually have that duty. So let's take that topic analysis and put it in some specific context. What kind of affirmatives might deal with the policing portion of this topic? Now, I'm going to focus for the first part of this on affirmatives that would deal exclusively with federal jurisdiction. As you may remember from our topic analysis video, there is certainly an incentive for affirmatives to cross over and deal with the states. We'll get to that in just a moment. But at a high level, the policing affirmatives fall into a few categories. Abolish a particular agency, so you could have an affirmative that abolishes ICE, the DEA, even the FBI. That would be a reform to policing, and we'd have a debate about whether it would be good for that law enforcement agency to exist. Defund a particular agency, so you could defund the FBI, you could defund DEA, you could defund ICE, or if you really wanted to get crazy, you could defund the National Parks Police, although I don't anticipate a whole lot of those affirmatives. Demilitarization of a law enforcement agency is certainly an affirmative you're likely to debate on this topic. One of the main arguments against the current state of law enforcement is how militarized certain law enforcement agencies are. They have SWAT teams, they have armored vehicles, they have guns and body armor that would be more typically seen in a military setting. These aren't your more traditional law enforcement officers, say, carrying a handgun. These are people carrying tactical suits and weapons better suited to combat. So you could have an affirmative that takes steps to remove those kind of weapons from the law enforcement agency. Then you're going to have affirmatives that seek to reform specific ways policing is done. And I use the word techniques here because that encompasses a lot of different categories. So you're going to see affirmatives about stop and frisk. That's an investigative technique where law enforcement can stop and sort of pat down a person if there's reasonable suspicion they're going to commit a crime. You might see reform in terms of the use of technology. So one of those would be facial recognition, the use of big data, predictive policing. Those are all computer-based techniques that we have that law enforcement use to identify potential suspects, observe crimes, things like that. And then you're going to have also some techniques that perhaps may run afoul of constitutional concerns, and so affirmatives will attempt to reform those. Finally, you're going to have qualified immunity reform. Qualified immunity is a concept that gives law enforcement immunity from civil liability in the performance of their duties. And civil liability refers to, if I think the police did wrong in regards to how they arrested me, I would attempt to sue them and get money for whatever damage they did to me. Qualified immunity provides officers the ability to say, you don't get to sue me because I was exercising the authority I've been given and I was discharging my duty. There are a lot of people out there who say that empowers bad police behavior. So you could see affirmatives that try to eliminate or change exactly how much qualified immunity law enforcement officials have. Now, as I mentioned, that's the specific reforms at the federal level. The state level reforms probably fall into one of these categories as well. It's just a question of how would the affirmative accomplish those. And that's typically, if you remember from our topic video, going to be done either by a direct mandate to the state or the use of federal funding to coerce or incentivize those reforms at the state level. But ultimately, the same policing issues an affirmative would talk about at the federal level are likely to be the same ones they talk about at the state level. Let's close out with negative strategies. What are some of the things that we can use to combat those affirmatives if we have to? Well, first and foremost, we can defend the policing issues they identify. For example, if they defund the FBI, we probably should be able to mount a robust defense of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or DEA, or ICE. Some of those may be a little more challenging than others, but there's going to be evidence and arguments for why those law enforcement agencies are good. We have soft on crime arguments, arguments that are based around the concept that if the public or criminals perceive the federal government and the law enforcement agencies as being weak on crime, there could be negative repercussions. Federalism is an argument that we're going to make against a lot of affirmatives. And if you watch our federalism video, you'll get a great breakdown on how we do that. But for affirmatives that attempt to regulate policing at the state level, this is a great argument. What goes hand in hand with that? The state's counterplan. If it's a state-level policing issue, don't have the federal government resolve it. Have the states deal with it. And finally, the vigilantes argument. This is a specific argument we have about, and it's similar to the soft on crime, but it's the notion that if there is a perception that we are weakening law enforcement, everyday citizens will have to take matters into their own hands and, for all intents and purposes, become vigilantes. So lots of potential negative strategies here that we can use against these affirmatives, in addition to some of the arguments that we will make as to why their affirmative isn't going to work, doesn't resolve a problem, or the problem may not be as big as it may appear.